On today's episode, the Chicago Blackhawks are aggressively trying to trade up in the 2023 NHL Draft, and I'll go over which teams they'll have the best chance of bargaining with here in the next month. All that and plenty more right here on Locked On Blackhawks.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everyone? Welcome on into another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today is Wednesday, May 31st. I'm your host, Jack Bushman. You can all find me out on Twitter at JackBushman2, or you could also go and check out my Strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey for all the latest Blackhawks news and updates. And real quick, just a reminder that you could subscribe or follow along 100% for free wherever you may be listening to your podcast and on YouTube. Make sure to go and do that real quick. I greatly appreciate it. Would put a big smile on my face. And that way you'll be able to get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. All right, good afternoon, everyone. As always, thank you all again for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Thank you all for making the show your very first listen here to start off your day. And to kick things off on the show here this afternoon, for segment one, I have a segment. It's probably going to take up the entirety of today's show, if I'm being honest, based on the way that I like to ramble about these sorts of things. But it's an episode that I'm very stoked to talk about. And it's been a recent, conversation that we've had a lot on the show, which is the Chicago Blackhawks aggressively trying to move up in the 2023 NHL Draft. Of course, we've heard Kyle Davidson kind of speak out about their aggressive mindset. Chief Scout Mike Donaghy said the same thing. So it's really no secret right now that the Blackhawks are actively pursuing an opportunity to maybe move up from the 19th overall pick, or maybe even get back into the first round for a third time like we saw them do last year. And the reason they're able to do this is because of the luxury of draft picks that general manager Kyle Davidson has been able to rack up since taking over as GM. And he's done a phenomenal job, as I've been preaching on the show for quite a while now here. But what I'm going to be discussing today, it was actually something I mentioned a little bit on yesterday's show. I kind of briefly pieced together some potential trade packages that we could see the Blackhawks making now that we officially know where each of their selections are going to be coming in the 2023 NHL Draft. I kind of threw some ideas out there on yesterday's episode, but here on the show today, I'm going to be taking a deeper dive into all of that good stuff, and I'm going to be discussing which teams we could be looking to trade with, and also what the cost has been to make a move, or a move somewhat like this, over the past couple of years. The first thing I wanted to do, though, was kind of take a look at which teams we could see the Blackhawks trade up with from the 19th overall spot. Now, this is something I've also talked about for the last couple of weeks now, but we've gotten some updates from Scott Wheeler, Scott Powers of The Athletic, a couple of different NHL draft sources and beat writers across the country, really, that kind of provide a different scope on things and a different outlook at this point in time. Obviously, we've heard the report that the Blackhawks aren't all that optimistic about their chances of trading up, at least pretty highly, from that 19th overall spot. I think a big part of that is just because this 2023 NHL Draft is highly regarded as, one of the deepest the game's ever seen. I don't really know all that many teams that are going to be aggressively trying to get out of their selections with all the good talent that's going to be on the board across the first couple of rounds. It really is a generational type talent of an NHL draft. But one thing we have heard is, the Vancouver Canucks. I've always been talking about how it just seems like destiny for these two teams to make a deal with one another at some point here in the offseason. So I do think Vancouver is certainly still in the conversation. I also think the Washington Capitals, who currently sit with the 8th overall pick, are in a very intriguing spot as well. And then two other potential move-up spots for the Blackhawks, not as drastic as the first two. I could see them possibly looking to move up to number 15, making a deal with the Penguins, or jumping up to number 16 and making a deal with the Vancouver Canucks. Those are kind of the four teams that I think are the most likely. I would say Vancouver, Pittsburgh, and Calgary are kind of in that boat together, while trading with the Washington Capitals, I do think, is a little bit more far-fetched. I'm being honest about that, but hey, this is what the offseason is for, is having fun conversations like these, drawing up fun hypothetical trade options, and who knows? I've kind of, not to toot my own horn here, but I was pretty close to nailing the Seth Jones trade just a couple of months before it ended up going down. I think I was like one draft pick away, and I involved Dylan Strome in that deal when he obviously wasn't. But, sometimes these do kind of turn out to fruition. More times than not, they'll wind up being stupid picks, but that's the fun of the offseason, folks, and that's why I'm stoked to kind of get into these options. So to kind of break things down a little bit more for all of you out there who might not be as familiar with the certain situations that some of these teams find themselves in right now, I'm kind of going to run through all four of those teams that I just mentioned real quick to give all you listeners out there some background of what they're thinking and what's going on in their front office right now. So the Capitals, as I mentioned, they have the 8th overall pick in the 2023 NHL Draft. That's their only first-round selection they have this year. They have 1 second-round pick and no third-round pick. They also have no second-round pick in 2024. At the moment, they're projected to have $7 million in cap space, but they're in a very intriguing situation and kind of in a tough spot. I guess it's more intriguing from an outsider's perspective. If you're a fan of fan of the Washington Capitals, it's not exactly the easiest of times right now, because this team obviously just fell short last year. They fired their new coach, or fired their coach. They're bringing in a new coach. They still have the aging core of Alexander Ovechkin, TJ Oshie, Nicholas Backstrom, Evgeny Kuznetsov, John Carlson. They're in a kind of a similar spot to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who I'll talk here in a second. It's like, are they going to continue to kind of go at this with the same team, or are they going to tear this all down eventually? But with having only $7 million in cap space, I wouldn't be surprised if Washington tried to shed some of that here in this offseason. And I think two players on their books right now that could be an option for the Chicago Blackhawks. I've talked about Anthony Mantha a couple of times here in the offseason. Kind of had, it's really been filled with struggles ever since he got acquired from the Detroit Red Wings. Jakub Vrana hasn't had a successful tenure up in Detroit so far either. That trade has kind of not worked for either side. I wouldn't be surprised if Washington ultimately ends up trying to move on from Mantha this offseason. I do think Nick Dowd could be another interesting piece that the Blackhawks could be looking at. He's got a cheap contract, team-friendly, 2 years, $1.3 million, but still a big enough difference that it gives the Capitals a little bit more flexibility. So those are kind of the two guys I think the Blackhawks would be interested in if Washington is trying to part ways with them. Moving on now to Vancouver, they, of course, have the 11th overall selection. Been mentioned a lot around the Chicago Blackhawks here since the Hawks won the draft lottery. Vancouver has the 11th overall pick. It's their only first-round pick this year. They have no second-round selections, but they do have 2/3 and 3/4. However, they don't have a second-round pick in 2024, just like the Washington Capitals. And they're in the worst spot of any team in terms of cap space at this point in time. They're $500,000 projected over the salary cap right now. So make no mistake about it, Vancouver is going to have to be getting rid of some players on their roster right now. There's been several names thrown around that I've talked about here on the show already. Brock Besser obviously makes sense. He's got 2 years left on his current deal at $6.5 million. I quite honestly think he makes a little more sense than Connor Garland, who's another guy has had his name thrown out there a bunch. He's still got 3 years left on his current deal at $4.95 million. If it were me, I'd probably rather have Brock Besser, considering it doesn't tie the Blackhawks up as long financially. And I do think Besser is the better player. And I think Anthony Beauvillier could be another option there, since he's only got 1 year left on his deal at $4.15 million. All three of those players, I think, are fits for the Blackhawks. Then dropping on down to the Pittsburgh Penguins, another peculiar situation here, as I just mentioned. They got the 15th overall pick. It's their only first. They don't have any seconds. They have 1 third-round pick, but nothing in the fourth. So only 2 picks right now for them within the first 4 rounds. They are projected to have $20 million in cap space, but they need to make some crucial decisions about what they're going to do moving forward with their aging core after missing the playoffs for the first time in 14 years or something along those lines. Obviously, they've completely gone in a new direction with their front office, still waiting to hear an announcement on that. But I wouldn't be surprised to see the Penguins kind of try and move some of the pieces that they have on their roster to free up some cap space under their new regime. I think Michael Granlund is a possibility. That trade just never worked out for them. I think he had 1 point in 21 games for the Penguins. Not very good. I don't know if he's the most intriguing option for the Blackhawks, as he's signed on at $5 million through the next 2 years. But if it does give them a good asset, they certainly have the flexibility in order to do that. And I think Jeff Carter could honestly be an intriguing option as well, only because he's 38 years old. No way the Penguins, if they are trying to be competitive next year, there's no reason for them to have an aging Jeff Carter on their roster. Will he be a help to the Blackhawks? Probably not on the ice, but he's a good veteran leader, a good guy that, the youngsters kind of look up to as a role model, and his cap hit only carries on through the end of next season. It's not like he's a long-term piece or anything along those lines. So I do think Granlund and Jeff Carter are two options for the Blackhawks from Pittsburgh. And then last, we have the Calgary Flames, who own the 16th overall selection. That's their only first-round pick this year. They do have a second-round selection, but no third. They've actually done a pretty good job of maintaining most of their draft picks for the next couple of years looking ahead. But they are projected to be right up against the salary cap as well. And after being disappointments this year following the big trade and the big signings they made in the offseason, obviously getting Jonathan Huberdeau from the Florida Panthers, which has definitely worked in Florida's favor more than it has in Calgary's thus far. They also go out and add Nazem Kadri out of free agency. For them to miss the playoffs, pretty unacceptable out of the Flames, and they fired Daryl Sutter as a result. That actually seems like it was something the players wanted there. But I do think Andrew Mangiapane, I've mentioned his name a couple of times here in the offseason, as he has 2 years left with a $5.8 million AAV and hasn't really been all that good offensively for Calgary for considering what he's getting paid. So I think Mangiapane could be an option for the Blackhawks as well. All right, folks, I know I've talked a lot there, breaking down kind of the situation where these teams are at this point in time. Coming up in just a moment, stick around because I'm going to be talking about some of the prices that we've seen, what it's cost teams in order to move up in the past NHL drafts. But first, real quick, I need to talk to you all about FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA Finals. The Denver Nuggets versus the Miami Heat. It's going to be an incredible matchup that you don't want to miss out on. And that's because right now, new customers at FanDuel can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. You just have to go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, go and place your first bet and get up to $2,500 back in bonus bets if your bet doesn't win. I've been riding hot lately with Nikola Jokic and Jimmy Butler over on their three-pointers. FanDuel has won me a lot of money throughout this NBA postseason. Make sure not to miss out on your chance to get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon when you join. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, we're back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast. Real quick, before I get into segment 2, shameless plug here for the show. I know I'm getting a lot of new viewers and new listeners here recently with a lot of buzz going on around the Blackhawks. If you haven't done so already, please do me a huge favor. Make sure to subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or if you're listening to today's episode, make sure to follow the podcast. Be downloading those episodes on a regular basis. It really does help me out tremendously. I'm on the push to get 1,000 subscribers here. I'd love to achieve that before the NHL Draft in less than a month, so I greatly appreciate all of the support. All right, segment 2, getting into some past prices that we've seen in recent years and what it's cost teams in order to move up in the NHL Draft. Now, one thing I do want to mention, and I kind of referenced this earlier, there really isn't anything to compare to the 2023 NHL Draft because of how highly respected this draft class is as a whole. As I mentioned, this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime type draft. It's the deepest draft most scouts can remember. There's a lot of top-tier talent. It's a really good opportunity for a lot of teams to get a special player. So that's why, maybe these teams won't be so aggressive in getting rid of their picks or won't be wanting to trade down as much. And at the same time, we could also see some of the costs in order to trade up kind of be a little bit higher than they have been in years past as a result of the deep draft class. So those are kind of some things to keep in mind here. But getting into what it's kind of cost teams in the past few years or in the past several years in order to move up within the top 10 or the top 15 of the NHL draft. One thing I did kind of notice when looking back on some of these important trades is most times when you're dealing with a pick inside the top 10, and honestly, inside the top 10 normally is probably like inside the top 15 and inside the top 20 this year, there's usually a star player getting swapped somewhere in there as well. Like we've seen with Erik Karlsson a couple of years ago. Obviously, Alex DeBrincat getting traded to the Ottawa Senators. The Blackhawks get the 7th overall selection in return from that. Seth Jones is another example that us Blackhawks fans can remember back to. The Blackhawks had to give up 2 picks within the top 10 there in order to get Seth Jones. And considering where the Blackhawks are at right now and what they have on their current roster, I just don't really, there's just no talent that they have that's going to be generating a top 10 pick unless they were to throw in a bunch of sweeteners. Seth Jones, because of that contract, I don't see any team willing to even really take calls on him at this point. Maybe Connor Murphy, but I still think the Blackhawks would have to sweeten the pot in order to get that top 10 type of selection. So it would likely need to have some sort of addition if the Blackhawks were going to move up that far. And that's why I think, going up to the 8th spot for the Washington Capitals, it's going to be hard to get Washington to budge from that pick. And the Blackhawks are going to have to throw a lot in their direction. So it's kind of tough when you look at getting a top 10 pick. But as far as picks number 15 and 16, I think there have been a couple of trades in recent NHL drafts that can kind of give us Blackhawks fans a little bit of an idea of what it's going to cost them if they want to go that route. In 2019, we saw the Arizona Coyotes move up from pick number 14 to pick number 11. That cost them just a mid-second round pick. Now, probably going to be more this year. And this is another similar one I think we could see and could relate to the Blackhawks if they want to trade up from number 19 to number 11 with a deal involving the Vancouver Canucks. In 2021, the Detroit Red Wings traded up from pick number 22 to pick number 14. They ended up taking goaltender Sebastian Cossa, and that cost them a 2nd round pick along with a 5th round pick. So there's kind of an idea baseline a little bit of what it would cost the Blackhawks, a 2nd round pick plus, and again, with this year being such a deep draft, they're probably going to have to sweeten the pot a little bit more. So with that being said, let's get into some potential deals that I've drawn together. And again, I'm kind of just going out on a limb here, but that's the fun of being an armchair GM in the offseason. You might not agree with all of these trades. You might think the Blackhawks are giving up too much or the other team isn't giving up enough. Whatever it may be, take everything with a grain of salt. This is the purpose of the offseason. But the trade that I have drawn together with the Washington Capitals involving the 8th overall pick is the Capitals sending the 8th pick and forward Anthony Mantha along with his, let me pull up and make sure I have this right. Anthony Mantha, I was going to say 5.8, so good thing I checked. The Caps are sending the 8th overall pick and Anthony Mantha with a 5.7 AAV through the end of next season to Chicago for the 19th overall pick, the 35th overall pick, which is the highest 2nd round selection that the Blackhawks have, and a 2024 second. The Blackhawks have 2 of those. They would be giving them Vancouver's in this situation. The reason why I think this type of deal makes sense, obviously the Capitals, if they're going to be trading away from number 8 and dropping back to number 19, they're going to have to be getting something that's worth their while. Well, first off, they get a little bit more cap flexibility by shedding Anthony Mantha's deal. That frees up nearly $6 million for them. They also get the 19th overall pick. They fall back 11 spots. They get the 35th overall selection, which is only 3 picks into the second round. And they also get a 2024 second round pick, which is a pick that they currently don't have at the moment. So with this deal, yes, the Capitals drop down 11 spots and they might miss out on a supreme talent. And that's probably why this deal is unlikely. And maybe the Blackhawks would have to give up a little bit more here. But I still think freeing up $6 million by shedding Anthony Mantha and getting a free 2024 second round pick, a pick that they don't have, helps add some depth to the prospect pool, along with the 35th overall selection. It gives them a second round pick. Do they have a second round pick this year? They might have one. They do. That would give them 2 second round picks and a second round pick next year. So it adds some depth to the prospect pool. I don't know. Like I said, this is probably the most unlikely of the bunch to go through, but that's kind of the deal that I've drawn together if the Blackhawks do pursue the 8th overall pick. Then for the Vancouver Canucks, this is where I think it really gets interesting and where I do believe we could see a deal made between these two teams at some point. The deal that I pieced together, the Vancouver Canucks send the 11th overall pick, a 2024 fourth round pick, and forward Brock Besser to Chicago for the 19th overall pick, the 35th overall pick, and a 2024 second round pick, which funny enough is actually Vancouver's. The Blackhawks acquired as part of the Riley Stillman and Jason Dickinson trade prior to last season. So with this pick, the Vancouver Canucks do drop down from number 11 to number 19, but they also get a second round pick in return, which like the Washington Capitals, they don't have a second round pick currently in the 2024 NHL Draft. They also get the 35th overall selection, which is the Blackhawks' highest second round pick, and they get to shed Brock Besser's contract off of their books, which is probably something they're just simply going to need to do because of the financial situation they're in. I quite honestly think that's a pretty fair trade. Maybe the Canucks don't add in that 2024 fourth round pick and the deal is still pretty fair. But I think the 11th and Besser for the Blackhawks to give them the 19th, the 35th, and a 2024 second, I think that deal does actually make a lot of sense. Go and comment down below if you agree with me, if you think that's too much, too little. I definitely want to hear all the listeners' inputs out there on these trades. Then for the Pittsburgh Penguins, they own the 15th overall selection. Obviously, the trade that I have drawn together is the Penguins sending the 15th overall pick and forward Jeff Carter to the Chicago Blackhawks for the 19th overall pick and the 44th pick in the 2023 NHL Draft, which is the second highest second round pick that the Blackhawks have. I think only moving back 4 spots and doing this new regime a favor by taking Jeff Carter's $3.1 million AAV off of their books. Maybe because it's such a deep draft class, the Blackhawks in this situation would still have to give up the 35th pick, but I think they are doing the Penguins a favor at the end of the day, and giving them the 44th overall selection is still pretty good in that deal to only move back 4 spots and shed some salary. And then for the Calgary Flames, they have the 16th overall pick. If the Blackhawks try and trade up with them, this is the deal that I put together. The Flames send the 16th overall pick and forward Andrew Mangiapane to Chicago for the 19th overall pick, the 35th overall pick, and forward Colin Blackwell. While I did kind of feel like in this situation, even though the Flames, the Blackhawks are doing the Flames a favor by taking on Andrew Mangiapane's contract, he is still a way more valuable player than Jeff Carter is at the end of the day. And Mangiapane could, have a resurgence at some point in time if he were to get dealt. That's why in this circumstance, I had the Blackhawks giving up the 35th pick for just to trade up 4 spots. That's kind of why I valued it a little bit differently. I also think Colin Blackwell is a cheap forward, and right now the Calgary Flames have a lot of tough decisions to make, and having a cheap bottom 6 guy like Colin Blackwell signed on for just $1.1 million through the end of next season, I think that's a deal that they could be intrigued by as well. So that's why I added Colin Blackwell to that deal along with the 35th pick and the 19th pick in order for the Blackhawks to move up 3 spots and nab Andrew Mangiapane. All right, folks, coming up in just a minute, I still have to get into what I think it would cost the Blackhawks in order to move back into the first round for a third time like we saw them do at last year's NHL Draft. All right, folks, we're back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast. Before I wrap up today's show, I am going to be picking up where I left off, and I wanted to talk about some potential targets for the Blackhawks if they do want to try and trade up from one of their second-round picks to get back into the first round with one of the later selections, like we saw them do last year when they traded with the Toronto Maple Leafs. They take on Peter Mrazek's contract. They wind up getting the 25th overall pick and take defenseman Sam Rinzel. So kind of glancing at the end of the NHL draft and some teams that I think would make sense for the Blackhawks to try and trade up with. I have 4 of them, just like I did with the number 19 pick. The first one that stood out to me was the New York Rangers, who have the 23rd overall pick. I also think the Toronto Maple Leafs could be looking to shed some salary and make some moves here in the offseason as well. They got the 28th overall selection, and then both the Montreal Canadiens and the Vegas Golden Knights. The Canadiens actually have the Florida Panthers first round pick, so obviously with the Stanley Cup final still needing to be sorted out, we don't know which of those teams is going to be picking 31st or 32nd, but I do think both the Montreal Canadiens and the Vegas Golden Knights are 2 teams of interest the Blackhawks may try and bargain with to get back into the first round. So starting off with the New York Rangers, the 23rd overall pick, it's their only first round selection they have this year, and then it gets pretty thin after that. They got no second, 1 third, no fourth. They got no third in 2024. They're pretty thin at this point in time in terms of some of their draft picks. They are projected to have $11 million in cap space, but some crucial decisions are looming for that organization as well. Keandre Miller, a top defenseman prospect, needs a new contract. So does former number 1 overall pick Alexis Lafreniere, who it's going to be very interesting to see what they wind up doing with him. And then, of course, both Patrick Kane and Vladimir Tarasenko, 2 trade deadline acquisitions, are currently free agents as well. So a lot of contracts and a lot of moves to be made, but not a whole lot of cap flexibility. A couple of guys I think do stick out in terms of potential trade targets for the Blackhawks. The first one, guy that's kind of been thrown out there a lot in recent rumors, has been Barclay Goodrow, former Stanley Cup champion with the Tampa Bay Lightning. He's got a 4-year contract, 4 years left still on his current deal at $3.6 million. And look, if you're winning Stanley Cups, you don't mind that deal. But when you're not, it's a lot of money to be paying a bottom 6 penalty killing type of guy. Yes, there is a lot that Barclay Goodrow could bring to the table, but make no mistake about it, that's a bad deal. I do wonder if the Blackhawks, while Kyle Davidson doesn't, like to have a lot of term on his books at this point in time, if it does get them into the first round, he might have to take on Goodrow's contract, and maybe they wind up buying him out a couple of years early as well. The Toronto Maple Leafs, their 28th pick is their only first-round selection. They also have no second, no third, and no fourth. They have no second in 2024 or 2025, and no first in 2025 because, of course, that's now owned by the Chicago Blackhawks. So, yeah, very interesting situation for the Toronto Maple Leafs right now as well. Kyle Dubas is obviously out as general manager. They have $9 million of cap space, but a lot of money to dish out, a lot of decisions to make for that organization. I think William Nylander, maybe they don't want to trade him right now and they want to run it back next year. And if he walks for free, he walks for free. But man, I'm really curious to see what that new regime is going to do with him because while Austin Matthews is going to be a free agent at the end of the season as well, as I talked about in my episode, I find it very hard to believe that they're going to let him walk out of Toronto and they're going to identify him as the problem of all the people up there. I think out of the core 4 that they have, William Nylander is the most likely one to depart. I do think it's very interesting, and the Blackhawks are certainly in a spot where they could press for him at this point in time. I also think restricted free agents Alexander Kerfoot and Zach Aston Reese could possibly work in a trade as well. And then for the Montreal Canadiens, they actually, because, this isn't their pick at number 31, they're in a pretty good spot in terms of future draft picks. They got 2 firsts this year, 1 second, 1 third, along with 3 fourths. They're pretty loaded on draft picks, so that's not much of a worry for them, but they do only have $9 million in cap space despite being one of the worst teams in the entire NHL this past season. Two guys who stood out to me as potential buyout candidates or trade candidates for the Blackhawks. Mike Hoffman, I've mentioned his name a couple of times here in the offseason. He's got 1 year left on his current deal at $4.5 million. And then I think Joel Armia could make sense as well. And he signed on for 2 years at $3.4 million. Sounds like Hoffman's the one that they're really trying to get rid of at this point in time. So I do wonder if he's on the Blackhawks radar at all. And then for the Vegas Golden Knights, we'll see if they're going to be picking 31st or 32nd. Such an interesting organization, absolutely sold everything in order to win now. They do have a couple of draft picks, though, and have done a pretty good job at holding their picks in the future. They have a first this year, no second, but 2/3, no fourth, but they own their first and seconds each of the next 2 years looking forward. Their issue is, once again, they're in salary cap hell. They're only projected to have $3 million in cap space, and taking a look at that roster, it almost feels like if they win the Stanley Cup, they're going to be in a very similar situation to the 2010 Chicago Blackhawks, where it's not something you want to do, but you simply got to cut off some of your meaningful players who have been with the franchise for quite some time. Like, there just aren't a lot of guys who make a lot of money that aren't the big name players for this team. The cap is taken up by most of their heavy hitters. So maybe Jonathan Marchessault has 1 year left on his deal, does have a no movement clause, but something's got to give here, it seems like, for Vegas if they want to have some freedom financially. Jonathan Marchessault, Riley Smith, Chandler Stevenson is probably due for a big raise after the year that he got. Still has 1 year left on his current deal, but it just feels like something has to give for Vegas. I think Chandler Stevenson, I don't know if they part ways with him or not. I think he and maybe someone like Will Carrier could be two interesting options for the Blackhawks. Two different type of players, of course, but Vegas is going to have to shed some money this offseason. That's just what's simply going to happen. So kind of taking everything into consideration, what it cost the Blackhawks last year in order to get back into the first round, kind of the deals that I put together here if the Blackhawks are trying to go that route, which honestly, even if they move up from number 19, I wouldn't be surprised to see them try and do this anyway, unless they give up a ton of picks in return. But the deal that I put together for the New York Rangers is New York sending the 23rd overall pick and forward Barclay Goodrow to Chicago for the 35th overall pick, the 44th overall pick, and the 67th pick. So this would cost the Blackhawks their two highest second-round selections along with their highest third-round pick, but they do get to jump all the way up from number 35 to number 23. That's a pretty big leap in, such a highly regarded NHL draft, moving up those 12 spots. It's going to cost the Blackhawks, and it honestly might even cost them more than this. But the reason I think this deal does make sense is because they're doing the Rangers a huge favor here by taking on Barclay Goodrow's contract. Of course, he does have a 15-team no-movement clause that would come into play here as well, but I do think this is a pretty fair deal for both sides here. The Rangers get to add some draft capital. They wind up with 2 more second-round picks. Yes, they do get bumped out of the first round, but they save, almost $4 million, and allows them to be a little bit more aggressive in this year's draft. They also get a third-round pick, too, which they don't have any seconds in this year's draft. They'd get 2 from the Blackhawks. They do have 1/3. That would give them another. Maybe they could package that and get another second-round pick. I do think that deal does make sense between the Hawks and the Rangers, though. Again, go and comment down below if you agree or disagree on all of these. I want to hear all the listeners' inputs out there. I don't know why I can't say that. For Toronto, I put together 2 deals here. One very interesting, not very likely, but I had to do it just for the sake of being entertaining. The first one that I put together was the Leafs sending the 28th overall pick to Chicago for the 35th overall selection, a 2024 second-round pick, and the 67th overall pick. So that would cost the Blackhawks their highest second-round selection this year. The reason I gave them a 2024 second is because Toronto has not done a very good job of keeping their draft picks. Their draft pool is very thin. I mentioned they don't have a second-round pick next year or in 2025. This would give them one of those, and they get a high third-round pick along with the 35th overall selection for the Blackhawks to move up 8 spots. I think that's a pretty good return, all things considered, for the Leafs. The kind of far-fetched trade that I put together involving William Nylander is the Leafs sending the 28th overall pick and William Nylander to Chicago for a 2025 first-round pick, which, funny enough, was actually Toronto's in the first place. We got that from the Sam Lafferty, Jake McCabe deal, along with a 2024 second-round pick, the 35th overall pick in this year's draft, the 44th overall pick in this year's draft, and a 2024 third. The Blackhawks have 2 third-round picks in the 2024 NHL Draft. This would also still leave them with 2 second-round selections in this year's draft. They have 2 first-round picks as well in 2025, and they have 2 second-round picks in 2024 as well. So while this would cut their draft capital down a little bit, they get to move up back into the first round for their third selection, and they also get forward William Nylander. Let me know if you think that's enough. I think that's a pretty fair deal for both sides. The Maple Leafs get a 2025 first-round pick, a 2024 second-round pick, and 2 2023 second-round picks, along with a 2024 third for the Blackhawks to move into the first round and get forward William Nylander. I think that's a pretty good deal. Obviously, extension would probably have to be agreed upon. I'd imagine maybe the Blackhawks do that with Nylander being a UFA a year down the road. Probably wouldn't be wise of Kyle Davidson, but that's kind of the far-fetched trade that I put together for those 2 teams. As far as the Montreal Canadiens go, I have them sending the 31st / the 32nd overall pick. Again, we don't know which one it's going to be at this point in time. I have them sending that pick along with forward Mike Hoffman to Chicago for the Hawks' 35th overall pick and a 2025 fifth. It's not a 2025 fifth. It was a 2023 fifth round selection in this year's NHL Draft. It's a pick the Canadiens currently do not have. They move back 3 to 4 spots, and they also get to shed Mike Hoffman's contract. I think that's a pretty good deal for both sides. And then for Vegas, I have them also sending the 31st / 32nd overall pick and forward William Carrier to the Blackhawks for just the 35th pick. The Blackhawks probably come out pretty good here, but at the same time, Vegas doesn't have a lot of choices. They have some tough decisions to make here in the offseason, and that's why I think, just shedding William Carrier's contract would be good enough for them, even if they're moving down 4 spots. All right, folks, I think that is going to wrap up Wednesday, May 31st episode of Locked On Blackhawks. As always, thank you all again for tuning into the show, and be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks right now for free wherever you may be listening to your podcasts, and go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube, and you'll be able to get the latest episode as soon as it comes out each and every day. Once again, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. You can find me out on Twitter at JackBushman2, or you could also go and check out my Strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey for all the latest Blackhawks news and updates. So until tomorrow's episode, that's going to do it here for the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.